I've been gone so long, some of you have forgotten who I am, but my name is David Horowitz, and this is a production of the David Horowitz Freedom Center. Briefly, what happened to me is my foot was paralyzed. I wish I could say it was from kicking James Carville or Sandra Fluke, but it was actually a botched hip operation. Be careful when you have them that you choose a decent surgeon. So my sciatic nerve was damaged, and that means paralysis and a lot of pain. I am on the mend. This is my first public appearance since March. The operation was on April 1st. That was another oversight on my part. And I'm here in part because I have a new doctor, and that doctor is the chairman of the David Horowitz Freedom Center, Michael Weiner. Thank you, Michael, for taking care of me. This is an important occasion. The young man who is our speaker today is transforming the center. He has two websites, Truth Revolt and Israel Revolt, which are much bigger than anything the center was able to do 15 years prior. It's very exciting if you've been up to these sites, and if you've seen the videos of Bill Whittle and Andrew Clavin, two brilliant performers. We have $1.5 million pledged to expand what Ben is doing, but it has to be matched. So I hope if there's anybody here who has, it doesn't matter, $5, $10, $50, $100,000. Well, it depends on how wealthy you are, doesn't it? $100,000 can seem like nickels and dimes to some people. But please consider seriously helping us match these funds and making the center grow. And that's because the center does one thing that almost nobody on the right does, and that is to call things by their right names. As Ben will be discoursing on today, we have a criminal in the White House. How do you, when you have a president who is a criminal, who has utter contempt for the Constitution, violates it every day, how do you rein him in? Well, who's the chief law enforcement officer in the land? He's a member of the same criminal gang. So what do? Well, one thing you can do is party. And so I'm going to invite you all. We're having a big party at my home on the 26th of July. I won't give the address out here on TV because there are so many idiots on the left who might cause trouble. Hopefully this won't come out till after the party anyway. But it's going to be a Western-style party. We have a DJ. Joel Gilbert's Dylan Legends Band is going to play. We're going to have pony rides for the kids and horse rides for adults. It's going to be a lot of fun. And it's to celebrate my new book, which is about how to fight the left, which is all we really do at the center. It's called Take No Prisoners. What else was I going to say here? It's worse than having a criminal, as Ben will also tell you, in the White House. This man is a communist, a lifelong communist. And therefore, his contempt for the Constitution is not like a criminal who doesn't like the law that he's breaking. He doesn't like the system of laws that we have, and he's determined to undo them. This is the most dangerous situation the United States has ever faced. And we have precious few leaders at the moment who are articulating the battle the way it needs to be articulated and fighting it. Republicans still think this is politics is normal. It isn't. So that's why what the Freedom Center does is so important, why Ben's book is so important, and why what he does at the center is so important. Thank you.
Well, thank you to David. Obviously, thank you to the center. And this is the only place on the right that does call things by their real name. There's a lot of weakness, unfortunately, on the right. That weakness on the right has led to an unending series of leftist victories over the last 80 years in this country, which has led to a growth of government that now puts us on the verge of what can only be termed an executive tyranny, an executive dictatorship, a dictatorship that we get to elect every 4 years, but then we are supposed to sit back and watch as our rights are trampled over. Last week, President Obama told a crowd in Minneapolis, quote, he was talking about the Republicans, of course, he's talking about the Congress. He said, they don't do anything except block me and call me names, because this is the most powerful man on earth whining. And he also said, they don't do anything except block me. And then Dick Durbin, he was talking about specifically about immigration, Dick Durbin last week added that because these folks only block him and call him names, President Obama would, quote, borrow the power that is needed to solve the problems of immigration. You borrow it, right? Sort of like you borrow your neighbor's cup of sugar, except you never give back the cup of sugar because you've used it. Right? When power is borrowed, it is never restored. That's the point of borrowing power in the first place. President Obama is always very happy to borrow power because, as David mentioned, the left is fundamentally opposed to the Constitution of the United States. They are fundamentally opposed to the basic founding concept of American freedom and liberty. They seek to tear it down. I disagree slightly with David in terms of the president being a communist. David knows communism significantly better than I do, so I'll defer to his definition of communism. But in my view, the president is beyond that. He is a nihilist. He wants to tear down the system almost solely for the sake of tearing down the system. It's not even about establishing equality or establishing a basic standard of rights or to avoid poverty. It's about tearing down the system purely and simply. Now, there are folks on the left who see the Constitution of the United States as a real obstacle. These folks include people who sit on the Supreme Court of the United States. Ruth Bader Ginsburg said not long ago, she said, quote, I would not look to the U.S. Constitution if I were drafting a constitution in the year 2012. I might look at the Constitution of South Africa. She said that was a deliberate attempt to have a fundamental instrument of government that embraced basic human rights, had an independent judiciary. It really is, I think, a great piece of work that was done, much more recent than the U.S. Constitution, which is, of course, why South Africa is such a thriving and wonderful and free country today. The South African Constitution contains the following provisions. Section 26 of that Constitution contains the right to housing, including the right to due process with regard to court-ordered eviction and demolition. Section 27 includes the rights to food, water, health care, and social assistance, which the state must progressively realize within the limits of its resources. This is the sort of constitution that the left wants, a constitution in which the government guarantees you stuff and violates your rights in order to guarantee you those things. And if they don't deliver on that promise, well, you know, they can't win them all. But the bottom line is that they will pretend to guarantee you these things. How do we know that they're just pretending? Because there have been other constitutions in the past that contain similar provisions. For example, there was a constitution in the recent past that suggested, quote, the distribution and usage of real estate should be supervised by the state in order to prevent abuse and in order to strive to secure healthy housing to all families, especially those with many children, in order to maintain health and the ability to work, in order to protect motherhood, and to prevent economic consequences of age weakness, and to protect against the vicissitudes of life. The state establishes a comprehensive system of insurances. This particular constitution also said that the state should transfer economic enterprises suited for nationalization into common property if the regulations for expropriation are obeyed and if compensation is not violated. I'm speaking, of course, of the Weimar Constitution. It guaranteed all of these rights. The Chinese Constitution similarly guarantees, for example, the rights of free speech and the rights of freedom of the press. In other words, these are all paper documents. The American Constitution is too. And the only people standing between us and the great maw of government that seeks to churn us up and spit us out is the will of the American people to stop this and to stand up for liberty. And all the guarantees, people who say that this is alarmist to talk in these sorts of terms, this is, I think, one of the great misnomers that we've experienced in modern history. We've bought our own propaganda with regard to folks like Hitler, in the sense that, yes, Hitler was evil, but Hitler didn't come in with the jackboots. Hitler came in, and he did it softly. If you read Hitler's speech, for example, right before the Enabling Act, right? He was arguing for the Enabling Act in 1933, right after the Reichstag fire. And Hitler, when he argued for the Enabling Act, which was an act that essentially ended all civil rights in Germany and handed unilateral power over to the Chancellor, namely Hitler, he actually said this, the direct quote, "The government will make use of these powers only insofar as they are essential for carrying out vitally necessary measures." He's going to borrow the power. Right? "The existence of neither the Reichstag nor the Reichsrat is endangered. The position and rights of the Reich President remain inviolate. It will always be the first and foremost task of the government to bring about inner consensus with his aims." He says the rights of churches will not be curtailed. Their position vis-a-vis the state will not be altered. The number of cases when there will be an internal necessity, like people here that we'll have to deal with, that'll be really limited. And this is what he said in 1933. And of course his opponent, who's a guy named Otto Wels, who's from the Social Democratic Party, he protested. He said, "Never in the history of the German Reichstag has control over public affairs vested in the elected representatives of the people been eliminated to this extent." And what's amazing about this particular exchange is that the president of the Reichstag at that time was Hermann Göring, who's obviously one of Hitler's emissaries. He's his right-hand man. And he actually got up in the middle of the speech and he shouted. He was the head of the legislature. He shouted at the head of the Social Democratic Party, which was the opposition party. He shouted at them, "Stop talking and listen to Hitler. Now the chancellor is getting even." He was getting up and he's rooting for Hitler in the middle of this legislative discussion. Sort of like, obviously there are differences, but on a systemic level, sort of like the modern Democratic Party, sort of like members of the Democratic Party who have decided that they are going to forego their legislative duty as a member of the legislative branch to check the executive. In other words, the goal is more important than the system. The goal is more important than the system. Now, the Constitution was established, it's not a value-neutral Constitution. Our Constitution was established in order to embody certain basic values, in order to protect certain basic values, right? It was established in order to protect certain inalienable rights. We celebrated this a few days ago, although the fact is that if you read the current list, if you read the list written in 1776 of the violations of the king, many of them pale in comparison to the sorts of violations of rights that we see today. And when it talks about the multiplicity of officers that have been sicked upon the people of the United States, for example, in the Declaration of Independence, he's talking about a few tax officials. And he's not talking about the IRS specifically targeting particular groups at the behest of the President of the United States. The Constitution of the United States was specifically designed, though, to preserve certain values, to embody certain fundamental beliefs about the nature of humanity. So, for example, it was supposed to create a check against the nature of mankind. This is why the founders truly believed you needed balance, you needed interest to counterbalance interest. The nature of mankind dictated that men were capable of great evil and men were capable of great good. But no man could be trusted with ultimate power because men were capable of great evil, which is, of course, exactly what Madison said in Federalist 51. He said, men are not angels. If they were angels, no government would be necessary. And if they were devils, no government should suffice. Basically, we're human beings, and that's why we need interest to counteract interest. But this is not the view of President Obama and people like him. In their view, people who are not President Obama are devils, and he is an angel. In his view, and the views of members of this administration, people who work for the government are by necessity good. They are a self-selected group of people who are only there for the best. All the rest of us are there for the worst. We're there for self-interest, evil self-interest. It's why you see President Obama and his wife go around to the rest of the country and say on a repeated basis that if you really want to do good for the country, don't go into private sector. Don't start a business. Give back to go into public service with a cushy government pension and a nice rate of pay and an arbitration process if you should happen to rape somebody. But if you really want to serve the public, what you want to do is get into the business of government, because that makes you a fundamentally better human being. And therefore, because you are now in this position, government should have all the power in the country. The Constitution was established on the basis that natural rights come from God, not from government. And that as soon as government violates those natural rights which come from God, you have a right to stand up to the government. And yet we are one vote away in this country, one vote, from religious rights in the country being finished. And I mean that very seriously. As an Orthodox Jew, it's something I take very seriously. If the Hobby Lobby case goes the other way, and remember it was a 5-4 vote, we are talking about the ability of the government of the United States to force religious people in their daily lives to violate their own religious precepts. Precisely the opposite of what the First Amendment was supposed to guarantee. The founders never would have contemplated this. For the founders, there was no conflict whatsoever between the idea that church was not supposed to infect state and the idea that state was not supposed to crush church. That's because government was supposed to be small. So the idea that government was ever going to infringe on American liberties so far as religious practice, that was unthinkable to the founders. We're there. It's where we are. Right? The Constitution was established in order to establish the basic principles that these rights cannot be taken away from you, that the government cannot arbitrarily apply the law. The government can't, for example, leave the border wide open in order to incentivize tens of thousands of illegal immigrant children to cross it, and then decide all of a sudden to apply the law when busing those kids to Murrieta. And the people who are telling the federal government that they ought to enforce the border become the real criminals in this administration. So what do you do when you're faced with a group of folks who fundamentally are criminals? Because in order to get to what they want, they have to tear down the Constitution. And because the Constitution is a system, they have to violate the system, they have to destroy the system, they have to tear it out by the roots. You have to engage in wildly law-breaking activity, and you need everybody to look the other way. Those are the two things that need to happen in order to achieve what we are looking at right now, which puts us on the verge of an executive tyranny, meaning that the President of the United States can do damn well what he pleases, and nobody can stop him. And we are now in that position. And I said this on Sean Hannity's show the other night. I said the President of the United States could literally strangle you, and might want to. Right? He could literally strangle you on this stage, and the American people could do nothing about it. Because the Constitution of the United States provided as the remedy for that impeachment. Well, Harry Reid doesn't like Sean Hannity very much, so if the President were to strangle Sean Hannity on a stage, then the President of the United States would then be subject to the whims of Eric Holder and Harry Reid, which means, of course, that nothing would ever happen. So it requires two things. One, a president who is willing to destroy all of the bounds on his own power, to burst forth, sort of like, as he puts it, a grizzly bear. And the president the other week said that the bear is loose. Talked about the bear is loose. He's going to do precisely what he wants. And he needs an American people that is compliant and a legislative body that is willing to hand him that power and do nothing about it. And fortunately for this particular president, that's exactly what he has. And this is a criminal presidency. It's important that folks understand. This is why, in my new book, The People versus Barack Obama, in that book, I make the case this is a criminal presidency, specifically because we cannot see this presidency as just more politics. This is not just more politics. What we are watching has nothing to do with politics. This has to do with criminal violations. If President Obama were in the private sector, he would be in prison, Eric Holder would be in prison, Kathleen Sebelius would be in prison, Lois Lerner would be in prison, everybody who is working at the ATF during Fast and Furious would be in prison. All of these folks would be in prison. The safest place to be a criminal in American society today is in the government. That is the safest place to be a criminal. If you're looking to steal from somebody, if you're looking to harm somebody, if you're looking to kill somebody, if you're looking to leave 4 people without guns in terrorist part of the world and watch them die, the safest place to do that and then run for president is in the government. So here are just a few of the crimes that this administration has pursued in furtherance of its goal, which is, of course, to destroy the Constitution and to destroy the American system as we know it. And this all sounds alarmist. To folks on the left, they say, oh, this is alarmist stuff. The president can't do anything that he wants. Well, then why are you arguing for him to be able to do anything that he wants? I mean, really, what exactly have you heard folks on the left say? The president has gone too far this time. Anything? Will they ever say that? Of course not. George W. Bush went too far because he was on the other side of the aisle. But President Obama, he can never go far enough. And in fact, we should work to ensure that he continues to go further. The president made an amazing statement the other day. The president of the United States actually said the other day, he was talking about the intransigence, the supposed intransigence of Congress. And he said, Congress won't work with me. I will continue to act to do whatever is necessary. He said, and if the Republicans don't like it, if they don't like it, they can join me. So these are the two choices in America right now. Bow to the dictatorship or bow to the dictatorship. Right? These are the two choices. So here are just some of the crimes that this administration has taken part in. Espionage. Right? You're not allowed to give money or guns to terrorist groups. Ask Hamas how that's working out for them. Because the President of the United States continues to sign $440 million worth of money over to the Palestinian Authority unity government, which includes Hamas and Islamic Jihad, State Department-sponsored terrorist organizations. And the State Department has sided with Hamas, with the Palestinian Authority, with Islamic Jihad, called on Israel for restraint against terrorist groups that kidnap young Jewish boys and then proceed to murder them. They're doing this now on the basis of this Palestinian kid who tragically was killed by Jewish extremists. There is a vast difference between the two sides. There are no streets going to be named after these Jewish pathetic pieces of human refuse who engaged in this conduct. They're going to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Every Jew who watched what happened on Sunday when this arrest took place and all this came out felt sick to his stomach. They felt like vomiting and never stopped vomiting. That was not true on the other side. When these 3 Jewish boys were killed, Hamas was celebrating. They ran ads in their newspapers showing these 3 Jewish boys as dead rats. Okay, there is a vast difference between the two sides, but of course this administration, this administration is not interested in any way in cracking down on terrorism. They're interested in funding terrorism. We've now reversed sides in the war on terror. Everybody who we were fighting has at one point or another received American money or guns, including ISIS, right, who are now fighting in Iraq. And both sides of that we're now funding. Right, Iran, we've relieved the sanctions on, so they're taking over the southern half of Iraq, and ISIS is taking over the northern half of Iraq because we funded their allies in the war against Bashar Assad, who, it turns out, we're now going to fund to fight ISIS. So we are now on every side of every issue, except the right side, which in that arena of the world is Israel and Israel alone. That's espionage, and it's a violation of the Arms Export Control Act to boot. The Arms Export Control Act suggests I cannot funnel, if I were to funnel a gun to ISIS, I'd be arrested. If President Obama does it, that's just American foreign policy. Involuntary manslaughter. Right, the basic case of involuntary manslaughter, I'm a lawyer, so the basic case for involuntary manslaughter is a 3-pronged test, right? Somebody died, number 1. Somebody died as a result of reckless action, number 2. Number 3, the person who took that reckless action knew it was reckless and could result in death at the time. Okay, those are the 3 elements of involuntary manslaughter. Benghazi, anyone? Leaving no security anywhere in the vicinity, in an area where we were running guns to Syria through Turkey. In an area where the New York Times had reported literally the year before that the entire town was run by Ansar al-Sharia. And surprise, surprise, Ansar al-Sharia was behind the terrorist attack that killed Chris Stevens and 3 other Americans. Right, who's responsible for that? Hillary Clinton's responsible for that. She's guilty of involuntary manslaughter. She shouldn't be worried about whether she goes to the White House. She should be worried about whether she goes to the big house. Unfortunately, we have an attorney general who would never prosecute anyone for these sorts of violations because he too is a criminal and he too is guilty of involuntary manslaughter, as it turns out. He greenlit the Fast and Furious program. Turns out that you might think that running guns to Mexican drug cartels, with no tags in them, by the way, there were no electronic monitors on these guns. It was widely known inside ATF that when you run guns to the Mexican drug cartels, the only place they're going to show up so that we can back-channel them, backtrack them, and figure out where they were is at crime scenes. This was explicitly known at the ATF at the time. You might think that's reckless. You might think that that might result in homicide, like the killing of a Border Patrol agent, perhaps. And you might be the head of the DOJ. And if you were involved in this, you were probably promoted. Because nobody who's responsible for Fast and Furious has gone to jail. Nobody's really even been fired. How about violation of internal revenue laws? If you or I were to leverage the IRS to crack down on particular folks, we would be put in jail. That's a violation of the Internal Revenue Code itself, 26 U.S. Code 7212 for people who are following. It's also a violation for politicians and for politically motivated bureaucrats to get involved, and this is a violation of the Hatch Act. Right? The Hatch Act prohibits bureaucrats from getting involved in political situations like this and targeting political opponents. It's a violation of law. But it's a phony scandal, according to the President of the United States. You want to know how corrupt and criminal and nasty this administration is? John Eastman runs the National Organization for Marriage. I'm sure some of you know of John. John's National Organization for Marriage is obviously a pro-traditional marriage organization. This administration is anti-traditional marriage, and so the IRS leaked the confidential tax information, including donor information, about the National Organization for Marriage, which is a 501c3, which means their donors are confidential. They leaked their entire donor list to the Human Rights Campaign, which is a gay advocacy group. Now, they used a middleman in order to do this. John's group, National Organization for Marriage, sued the IRS. The IRS acknowledged that they had, in fact, leaked this material and signed over $50,000 of your tax dollars to the National Organization for Marriage. Now, what John did is John said, okay, fine. You know, we'd like to find out who particularly at the IRS did this. Let's trace this back up the chain. Who decided that it would be a great idea to hand over confidential tax information to political opponents? Right? Who decided that that would be a great idea? So they said to Eric Holder, why don't you prosecute the middleman? Right, who had received the confidential tax information and distributed it in violation of law. Why don't you prosecute him? Eric Holder said, no one will be prosecuted for this. No one will be prosecuted for this. So John said, okay, fine. You're not going to prosecute him. Give him immunity. Because this guy was pleading the fifth. You can only plead the fifth if there is a threat of criminal prosecution. Right? You can't plead the fifth. If you come to me and you ask me, If I was cheating on my wife, I can't just say I plead the Fifth. That has no relevance. You're not threatening to criminally prosecute me. The Fifth Amendment is only available in situations in which you do not have immunity. So John said to Eric Holder, go ahead, give this guy immunity, then we can sue the IRS, we can subpoena him, and we can force him to answer questions about where he got this material. And Eric Holder said, I will not give him immunity. So in other words, he won't prosecute the guy to get the information, and he won't get immunity. He won't give immunity so the guy would give up the information. This is the height of criminality, and it's so blatant. And yet, has anybody outside this room ever heard of the National Organization for Marriage? Can you imagine if the NAACP had sued Bush's IRS, and Bush's IRS had said, yeah, you know what, we discriminated against you, here's a $50,000 settlement. You think that might lead the news for a few nights? But for the Obama administration, it will not even make the back page of the New York Times. How about unauthorized disclosure of information? You're not allowed to leak confidential national security information, and yet this administration has done that repeatedly. This administration has done it 4 separate times with regard to Israeli national security information, sunk Israel's ability to strike Iran. Israel was supposed to use an airbase in Azerbaijan to strike Iran. That was leaked by the Defense Department to the New York Times. Israel was supposed to work with the Saudis to use Saudi airspace to strike Iran. That was leaked by the Defense Department to the New York Times. Israel was behind Stuxnet. That was leaked by the Defense Department to the Washington Post. And Israel was working out agreements with particular groups to go in and try and decapitate some of the heads of the nuclear program. That was also leaked by the Defense Department to the Washington Post. But it's not just Israeli national security information that's being leaked. You know how we all knew that President Obama had his kill list? You know, Rand Paul has been very big on President Obama has his kill list. American citizens abroad who he just decides we can kill. Which, by the way, is, regardless of what you think of the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki, and I'm fine with it, he's a terrorist, he deserved to die, the possibility that we now live in a country where the president can determine, based on which side of the bed he woke up this morning, whether to hit somebody with a drone or trade them for 5 Taliban terrorists is frightening. That should be frightening. Bo Bergdahl was no friend to the United States, according to most reports. And yet he was an American citizen who had to be brought home just in time for the president to quash the VA scandal. He had to be brought home at the cost of 5 top Taliban officials. Because he was an American citizen, he had to be brought home. Well, if his name happened to be Anwar, he'd be dead from a drone strike in Yemen. So the president literally, I mean, that is, if there's anything that speaks to dictatorial power, it is the ability of the president to unilaterally declare who is an American citizen and who is not an American citizen for the purposes of hitting them with a drone or trading terrorists for them. Deprivation of rights under color of law. The fact is that what the Obama administration has done, as far as the mining of metadata, and I'm a hawk on national security, is far beyond the scope of the Patriot Act. Far beyond the scope of the Patriot Act. Representative Sensenbrenner has said as much. Right? Sensenbrenner, who wrote the Patriot Act, said if I had ever conceived that the Patriot Act would be this widely applied by the President of the United States to be checking our Gmails and our Gchats and our metadata on our phones, I never would have signed off on the thing. This is a violation of our rights under color of law. Bribery, obviously, is rampant within this administration. The president has paid off unions. The president has paid off various political allies with ambassadorships. He's paid them off with cash to their companies. I mean, some of the statistics on bribery from this administration are just stunning. Overall, the Washington Post has reported $3.9 billion in federal grants and financing flow to 21 companies backed by firms with connections to 5 Obama administration staffers and advisors, according to Peter Schweitzer. The Obama administration's $20 billion in green technology loans contained $16 billion. So $4 out of $5 for the green technology loans went to companies related to President Obama or his cronies. Bribery is rampant within this administration. And then, of course, there's obstruction of justice, in which the federal government gets involved in cases it has no business in. Cases like, for example, the George Zimmerman case in Florida, in which the DOJ inserted its thumb on the scales of justice and attempted to convict George Zimmerman before the evidence was even in. Or the case of Gerald Walpin, the Inspector General, who was fired when he investigated President Obama's friend in Sacramento, the mayor, Kevin Johnson. He was fired unceremoniously. Or the case of the new Black Panthers, in which the Department of Justice decided it just wasn't worthwhile checking out people waving batons outside of polling places because they happen to be black, but if you want to check an ID of a black person, then you're a racist. So, what we have here, obviously at this point, is a criminal administration. We're seeing it every day. The only problem with the book is I had to stop writing it at some point. What we're watching on the southern border, obviously, is, in my opinion, the single most grave threat to national security that we have seen over the course of this presidency, and that's saying a hell of a lot considering we have a president who just surrendered Iraq to terrorists, has put Israel in mortal danger, and has signed a nuclear deal with Iran. But what we are watching on our southern border is a threat to the very existence of the United States, and it is specifically, there are people who are out there, folks on the left, and it's incredible, the skewed view of folks on the left, truly astonishing. Somebody wrote a column at USA Today saying, is this Obama's Katrina? Is this Obama's Katrina? No, it's not Obama's Katrina. That was a hurricane. That was an act of God. It just shows the hatred for President Bush on folks on the left. It is not even wildly comparable. In your worst imagination, it's not comparable. President Obama created this hurricane.